The snow whispered down in a hush, soft as breath, soft as memory. It blanketed the roof of the sagging settler's cabin until it vanished into the white world, a forgotten shape under a heavy sky. Only the thin curl of smoke, faint, fading, gave any sign that life still clung within. Inside, the fire had gone out hours ago. She sat near the hearth, knees drawn to her chest, a thin wool shawl clutched around her shoulders. Her skin looked like paper left out in the sun too long, her lips cracked, tinged with blue. One baby lay nestled beneath the crook of her arm, the other across her chest in a sling made from torn bedsheets. Both stirred weakly, not quite crying anymore. Just little gasps, like birds too cold to sing. Her name had once been Amelia Hastings. Back before her hands were always trembling, before her days were measured by the ache in her back and the tight pull of milk in her chest. Back when she believed that kindness, if offered enough times, might come back to her. But kindness hadn't come. Not from her husband. Not from the town. Not even from the land, which had frozen early this year, swallowing the roads and silencing the birds. Even the pine trees looked like they'd turned their backs. Her eyes stayed fixed on the cold hearth. She had tried to relight it. Twice. 3 times. She had scraped the flint until her fingers bled, her palms raw. But the kindling was damp, and her hands too clumsy now. The last match had snapped in half when she struck it. She had stared at the broken piece for a long time before tossing it into the ashes, where it joined the bones of last night's warmth. The babies fussed again, and she shifted them gently, her body a shield against the cold. One suckled half-heartedly. The other barely opened its eyes. She whispered something to them, a lullaby, without a tune. Her voice caught in her throat. A month ago, she had bled out on the floorboards, thinking she was dying. But death hadn't come then. Only pain, and the terrifying silence after the crying started. 2 infants she had no idea how to hold, how to feed, how to name. When her husband left that morning, in early November, he had said nothing. No farewell, no glance back. Just walked out the door, saddle creaking, boots crunching in the frost. She had stood in the doorway as long as she could, watching the snow swallow his shape. Her fingers had clutched her round belly then. She remembered thinking, "Don't come back," and then, a heartbeat later, "But please come back." He hadn't. The townsfolk had stopped calling by then. They said the land had cursed her, barren for 5 years, then suddenly heavy with twins. Some whispered witchcraft. Others just crossed the street. Amelia closed her eyes. Her pulse thudded low in her ears. The world tilted slightly. Or maybe she did. She tried to stand, but her knees wobbled. She slid down the wall instead, the babies cushioned in her arms. The room seemed to darken, though no lamps had been lit to begin with. She needed to get help. She knew that. But where? The nearest town was 6 miles, maybe more with the snow. And she wouldn't make it with 2 infants, not without food, not without fire. Still, something stirred in her. Not hope, not quite. Just the old settler stubbornness. That raw-boned will to walk on even with cracked soles and an empty belly. She pressed a kiss to the damp forehead of her smaller child, then shifted them both into a makeshift sling beneath her shawl. Her breath came hard. Her legs felt carved from ash. She opened the door. Snow hit her like a wall. The wind moaned low through the trees. The sky stretched gray and endless. Amelia took 1 step, then another. She didn't think. She just moved, each footfall a prayer, each breath a thread. The trees closed around her like cathedral columns. She walked until the cabin was gone, until the cold no longer stung, just numbed. Her vision blurred. The babies were silent now, tucked close to her chest. She stumbled once, catching herself on a branch. Then again, falling to her knees. Her skirts soaked through. She tried to rise. Couldn't. She tried again. The 3rd time, she stayed down. She found herself under a pine tree, the old kind with branches that bend low and offer shelter. Snow drifted gently onto her shoulders. Her breath came slower now. The babies barely stirred. Amelia curled around them, arms tightening instinctively. There was no fear left, only a kind of stillness, deep and bone-hollowed. Her eyes fluttered, and the forest blurred into a watercolor of white and shadow. A sound broke through, not loud, but sharp. Distant hoofbeats, muffled by snow. A rhythm like the old heartbeat of the earth. She didn't lift her head. Couldn't. She only whispered, so faintly it might have been a dream. "Please, not yet." And then nothing but the hush again, snow settling, branches sighing, the twin's breath against her skin. But the hoofbeats did not fade. They drew nearer, and nearer, until something warm, solid, and alive stepped into the clearing. A silhouette in the snow, tall, still, wrapped in wool and earth tones. A man, horse at his back, bow slung across his chest. He did not speak. He knelt, placed a bare hand gently at her throat, then over one baby's chest, then the other. Amelia didn't wake, but her fingers, curled around the children, flexed slightly. The man took off his cloak and wrapped it around all three. He moved as if the world might break if he was too sudden. He gathered them up, the woman and her children, cradling them with a kind of reverence. The snow fell heavier now, hiding their footprints almost as fast as they were made. The forest closed behind them. The only sign they'd been there at all was a faint impression in the snow, a place where death nearly came and passed by. The pine trees stood tall and mute, their boughs heavy with snow, the forest hushed under a sky the color of smoke. Nothing moved but the slow, steady rhythm of hooves on softened earth, not hurried, not aimless, just steady, certain, the kind of sound that barely breaks the silence, only parts it like a respectful whisper. The man astride the horse wore no badge, no band of color to mark him, only dark-washed wool and deerskin layered against the cold. His long hair was tied with leather cord, and his eyes, deep-set, almond-shaped, black as crow's wing, swept the land as if listening to something others could not hear. He was Navajo, though most in the nearby towns would not have known what that meant beyond the usual lies. They would have called him savage or ghost walker, depending on their fear. But the truth was simpler. He was a scout, a tracker, a man of the high desert, come north for reasons he didn't speak aloud, not even to himself. He had followed the elk first, and then the quiet. It had begun as a wrongness in the wind, a scent not native to this stretch of pines, smoke too faint for campfire, the sour trace of old milk, of blood cooled and dried. Not fresh death, but something close, something waiting on the edge of it. He had not meant to turn his horse, but the animal obeyed some instinct of its own, veering slightly off the game trail and into the deeper woods. He allowed it. They came upon the shape beneath the tree as dusk pressed down. Not a deer, not a bear. Something smaller, human, folded, curled inward like a seed. He dismounted without a word. 3 forms: woman, child, and child again, though one had to look closely to know they were more than a single tangled being. Snow gathered lightly over their backs. The woman's skin had the look of thin stone, her lips gone nearly gray, but her arms still wrapped the infants tightly, a mother's last instinct outliving her strength. He knelt beside her, resting 2 fingers at the soft edge of her throat. A pulse, faint but present. He felt it again on the smaller bodies, those barely their flickers of life still folded into their fragile chests. His breath rose in a long, slow cloud. He said nothing. No prayers. No cries for help. Just reached for his cloak, thick-woven, smoked against rain, and wrapped it around them all. When he lifted her, the woman did not stir. Her weight was slight, more memory than flesh. He cradled her against him with the ease of one used to carrying silence. The babies he tucked within the folds of fur and wool, their heads nestled at his collarbone where his own warmth might catch them. The ride was slow. He did not go toward town. He had passed that place a week before, all sharp glances and tight mouths. He knew what they thought of women like her, what they might do or not do if he appeared with her in his arms. So he went the other way, deeper. There was a cabin he knew of. Not his, not anymore, but still standing. Once used by trappers who respected neither animal nor season. They'd abandoned it when the river dried up. He had passed through the place during fall, patched the holes in the roof himself with bark and hide. Now it waited. He reached it by dark, the horse huffing plumes of frost, its coat dusted white. Inside, the air held the smell of cedar and old tobacco. He set her down on the narrow cot and wrapped her again in furs, checking her fingers, her cheeks, her breath. The babies were colder still, barely mewling now. He fed them drop by drop from a pouch of goat's milk mixed with herbs. Not perfect, but it would hold them. Through the night, he worked quietly. The fire took time. The wood was dry but stubborn. Sparks finally caught, then spread, bright fingers licking the blackened stones of the hearth. He set a pot to boil snow, stirred in bark shavings, crushed leaves, a few tender roots. He did not sleep. When the woman stirred the next morning, it was not sudden. Her eyes fluttered open like a curtain left half unfastened. She blinked against the low light and tried to rise. Her limbs failed her. He was near, seated on the floor, feeding one of the infants by firelight. His back was straight, his motions gentle. He did not look up at her right away. Only when the child gave a small grunt of contentment did he glance over. Their eyes met. She did not speak. Neither did he. But something passed between them. Not relief, not gratitude. Something quieter. The recognition of life, where only death had been expected. He handed her the baby then, not slowly, not ceremoniously, just as one would return something valuable, something rightfully hers. She took the child with trembling arms, clutching her close, burying her face against the warm skin. Her shoulders shook, though no sound escaped her. He looked away. Later, when her strength allowed her to sit, she asked, "Who are you?" He didn't answer at first. He stood instead, added more wood to the fire. The flames danced in his eyes, turning them copper for a moment. Then finally, "They call me Toe." His voice was low, like the edge of water in a canyon. Always there, even when you could barely hear it. She nodded once, as if that was enough. As if his name settled something loose inside her. Amelia. That was what she said when he asked in return, though her voice cracked around it. Amelia Hastings, as though it still belonged to someone else. The next few days unfolded like slow pages turned by wind. There was no conversation beyond the necessary. No questions about the past, no explanations. Only the sounds of the fire, the soft coos of the babies, and the scrape of a knife against bark as he shaped a cradleboard from pine. She watched him often, in quiet moments when the children slept. The way he moved, not with hesitation, but care, as if the world had to be handled with dignity. He rarely looked at her directly. And yet, when she faltered while carrying water, his hand was there without prompting. When one child would not sleep, he rocked them with a gentle rhythm she could not imitate. His lullabies came in a tongue she did not know, low and melodic, almost like prayer. She found herself listening to him more than speaking. And in the stillness, her body began to mend. The blue left her lips. Her milk came in stronger. Her sleep deepened, unbroken by fear. The babies grew warmer, heavier in her arms. On the fourth day, a snowstorm rolled in. The wind keened outside the shuttered windows, sharp and wild. Inside, the fire glowed gold against the log walls. Amelia sat beside it, both children dozing in her lap. Toe sat across from her, cleaning his bow with a scrap of cloth. The silence was full, not empty. She spoke without looking up. "I thought I was dying." He paused, then said, "You were." Another silence. She swallowed, traced a finger along the curve of her daughter's cheek. "Why did you come?" "To follow something that wasn't right," he said simply. The snow had quiet where there should have been sound. She closed her eyes, letting that answer wrap around her like the cloak he'd used to save them. There were things she wanted to ask. About his past. Why he stayed. What he wanted. But she didn't ask. Some truths didn't need naming to be known. Outside, the wind howled like some old spirit mourning the dead. Inside, the cradle Toe had built rested beside the fire, and two babies breathed slow and sure. Amelia leaned her head against the wall and watched the flames. She did not smile, but she was no longer frozen. And in the hush between them, something warm began to grow. Not love, not yet, but its beginning. Something earned, not owed. Something living, something that would stay. The days did not pass so much as settle, like dust on old beams or snow on stone. Time inside the cabin moved in a rhythm not marked by clocks or calendars, but by firewood stacked, by babies fed, by the soft creak of wood warming after frost. Amelia no longer felt the line between survival and life so sharply, though she remained cautious of its nearness. Her body, once brittle with cold and grief, began to thicken with steadiness. Her legs carried her from the cot to the hearth now. Her hands no longer trembled when wrapping the twins against her chest. Toe remained, not as a guest, not as a caretaker, simply as a presence. He rose before the sun and returned after it dipped, always with something useful in his hands. Dry kindling, roots from beneath the snow, strips of cured meat. He rarely spoke unless there was reason, yet nothing in his silence ever felt distant. Instead, it settled between them like a shared blanket, the kind of quiet that made room for breath. They did not speak of the past. He did not ask where her husband had gone. She did not ask what trail had brought him this far north, alone. These were not the kind of wounds that healed through retelling. They simply learned each other's patterns, the cadence of footsteps, the weight of mood in a room, the tilt of a glance before it turned away. She watched him when he worked, careful not to let him notice. The way he shaped the pine cradle, whittling it slowly, sanding the edges smooth with a piece of leather and river stone. He touched the wood like it held memory, not just grain. He moved with reverence, not toward her exactly, but toward the space she now occupied, as if he understood the fragility of someone just beginning again. Sometimes, when the babies cried and Amelia felt the fray of her edges returning, he would take them without words, rock one in the crook of his arm while tending to the fire, or carry both swaddled against his chest while chopping more wood outside. The children quieted around him, as if they sensed the absence of panic in his movements. He did not coo, did not babble. He simply stayed. Amelia's days began to find shape again. She boiled water for cloths, mashed dried berries with wild honey when she could find it. Her milk flowed steadily now. The pain in her ribs had dulled, replaced by a strange softness she didn't yet trust, the ache of not being alone. She began to hum again, not songs with words, just half-remembered melodies, bits of lullaby and hymn woven into one another. Sometimes, Toe would pause near the doorway when she sang, not close, not listening directly, just near enough that his stillness felt like attention. One evening, while snow tapped against the roof like a patient guest, Amelia sat by the fire and watched the cradle swaying gently. The baby slept belly to belly, tiny fists curled. Her hands were sore from gathering and stitching scraps of linen into swaddles. The needle had pricked her thumb, and a dark bloom of dried blood marked the fabric. She stared at it, wondering at the odd beauty in something so small, so human. Toe sat across the room, restringing his bow with new sinew. His hair was loose, drying from a recent wash, and the fire made it glint like wet earth. His fingers worked quickly, but not carelessly. She found herself watching those fingers more than the task they performed. "I used to sew," she said, not looking up from the blood-specked cloth. "When I was a girl. Doll dresses. Pillow seams." Toe didn't respond at first, but his hands slowed slightly. Then, softly, "Good hands remember." She let the quiet stretch. "I didn't think mine would." He nodded once, as if that truth needed no fixing. Later that night, when a windstorm clawed at the shutters and one of the twins cried with a feverish whimper, Amelia felt the fear claw up again, that old, sharp beast of helplessness. She lifted the child, tried to nurse, but the baby refused to latch. She bounced her gently, then more firmly. Her own breath began to break. Toe appeared without sound. He reached out, pausing just long enough for her to choose. She handed the baby over. He cradled the child against his chest, pulled the blanket higher, then began a low hum, a tonal, spiraling sound, not quite melody. It wrapped around the baby like smoke, gentle and circling. The tiny body calmed. The crying ebbed. Amelia watched, tears catching along her lashes, unnoticed. She hadn't meant to weep. It simply happened, a slow leak of something long dammed. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect it. The next day, the fever passed. When morning came, pale and bright as new parchment, Amelia opened the cabin door and stepped outside without leaning on the frame. The air still held winter's breath, but the sun touched her face with something close to promise. Toe was by the edge of the clearing, examining a rabbit snare. She didn't call to him. She just stood there, the babies asleep inside on the fur-lined cradle. She looked at the trees, not as a place that had tried to kill her, but as something else now. Shelter. Witness. The place she had not died. That evening, she roasted a handful of tubers Toe had brought, adding the last of the salt she'd found in a tin buried deep in her satchel. They ate together at the low table he had built, one carved from a felled aspen, with legs that didn't quite match. Amelia watched him eat in his quiet way, never greedy, never rushed. When he caught her gaze, he didn't look away. "I didn't think anyone would come," she said. He didn't need to ask when. "I laid down to die," she continued, voice soft. "And part of me wanted to." Toe set his bowl down, hands resting on either side. "You didn't die." She nodded slowly. "Because you found me." His reply came slow, measured, as if spoken from a deeper place. "I found someone who hadn't left yet." They didn't speak more that night. The fire burned steady, throwing shadows on the log walls like dancers long forgotten. The babies stirred only once, and then settled. Before Amelia drifted to sleep, she looked at the cradle, then at the man who had carved it. There was still pain, yes, still grief with no place to settle. But there was something else now, too. A shape beneath the ash. Not love, not yet, but the first ember of it. And in the dark, she turned toward the warmth, not away. Spring came in a hush, not a trumpet. The snow melted slow, like it was reluctant to leave, and the pines stood dripping in silence. Ice loosened its grip on the earth, and the river began to murmur again beneath the crust of frost. Amelia watched it from the porch, the twins bundled in her arms, their small breaths soft against her collarbone. Toe stood a little ways off, checking the packs. He did not try to change her mind. It was Amelia who said the words first. "I have to go back." She didn't explain it, didn't name the things buried under that need. Land papers, debts, a grave she hadn't yet dug. Toe only nodded. There was no trace of disappointment in his face, only the kind of quiet understanding that came from someone who had long ago stopped expecting the world to be kind. They traveled slow. The wagon had rotted through the winter, so Toe led the horse on foot, with Amelia and the twins balanced in a carrier strapped to his back. She offered to take turns, but he shook his head. "You've carried enough." The road was harder than she remembered. Frozen ruts turned to mud, and even the trees seemed less friendly, more like watchers and guardians. Amelia kept her eyes forward. She tried not to remember the last time she'd seen this path, hollow-bellied, staggering through the snow, praying for death or mercy. The town appeared like a smudge on the horizon, smoke rising from chimneys too clean, too neat. It hadn't changed. That made it harder. She had. They entered just after noon, when the sun was high and judgment clearer. Amelia felt the first stares before she saw them, eyes on her from behind lace curtains, from porches with idle brooms. Some paused their sweeping. Others pretended not to see her. The twins made no sound, but she could feel their small bodies tense against her chest, sensing the change. The general store was the first stop. She needed flour, a spool of thread, soap. Toe tied the horse and stayed outside, arms folded loosely. His presence alone drew looks, long, cautious, like men watching fire from across a field. Inside, the bell over the door rang out like an accusation. The storekeeper was a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Brecken, who had once offered Amelia a pie after church, back when she was newlywed. Now she simply stared. "Well," she said at last, "didn't expect to see you back." Amelia said nothing at first. She placed a list of items on the counter and reached into her satchel for coins. Mrs. Brecken didn't move. Her eyes drifted to the sling, where one twin stirred and let out a soft noise. "I heard your man left. Took a job down south." "He's dead," Amelia replied evenly. "If he ever counted as mine." There was no sorrow in her voice, only truth. It hung there, quiet and cold. The woman pursed her lips. That cradleboard out front. You come back with a Navajo. Amelia didn't flinch. I came back alive. That ended the conversation. The goods were bagged without small talk. No offer of credit. No farewell. On the street, a boy threw a rock that missed the horse's leg by inches. Toe didn't move, didn't react. Amelia saw his jaw tighten, saw the way his hand hovered for a moment, not near a weapon, but like he was measuring the weight of restraint. They passed the church on their way to the undertaker's. Amelia paused. The shutters were open. Hymns drifted from the windows like smoke from an old fire. Inside, the pews were clean. No one turned to look at her. The graveyard behind the chapel had a space between the rows, an old field her husband had staked out for them, long before time had shown him what for better or worse really meant. Amelia knelt in the thawing dirt. She had no headstone, no words, just a rough cross of bark tied with twine. She didn't cry. She only whispered, "You left me in the snow." The wind did not answer. She hadn't expected it to. Toe waited by the fence. When she returned to him, her hands were dirty. He offered her a cloth. She took it, folded it into her palm, and did not let go. That night, they camped at the edge of town rather than beg shelter from anyone with a roof. Toe lit a fire with pine cones and dried moss. The children slept in the cradle he'd tied to a bough. Amelia sat with her knees tucked to her chest, staring into the flames. "It hasn't changed," she said after a while. "No," he replied. "I thought maybe if I showed them I survived, they'd see me different." He didn't correct her, just let the silence stretch, safe and steady. She turned to him, eyes sharp in the firelight. "They don't want me. Not the children. Not my grief. Not the kind of strength that comes from crawling out of a grave." Toe looked at her, long and full. "I do." The words were soft, but they landed like a stone in still water. Amelia didn't speak. She didn't need to. Something in her face cracked, not broke, but opened. A small shift, like ice turning to water. Not love, not yet. But trust, grown from firelight and long silences. Trust that did not ask her to earn her worth. The next morning, before the town could fully wake, they walked away. Amelia didn't look back. They took the north road, where the pines thickened and the land was still half wild. There were other places to live, places with no memories etched into every doorframe, places that didn't require her to shrink in order to belong. The sky broke open at midday. Rain came down in a slow weeping mist, soft enough not to chill, but steady enough to soak through threadbare sleeves. Toe didn't curse it. Amelia didn't either. They simply walked, two figures moving through the wet, green hush of spring, the baby snug between them. It wasn't freedom yet, but it was forward. And as the rain traced down her temple, Amelia reached for Toe's hand. Not to be led, not to be saved, but to walk beside. The new land was quieter. They found it past a crooked bend in the river, where the trees grew thinner and the hills rolled soft like folded quilts. No fences, no footsteps. Just grass bent by wind, and birds calling names that no white town had ever written down. The land didn't ask who she was. It didn't care where she'd come from. That made it easier to breathe. They built slowly. First a lean-to, then the cabin. Not grand, not even sturdy by rancher standards, but it stood upright and dry, and Amelia had a say in where every beam laid. Toe cut the wood himself, singing low sometimes in his language, voice deep and sure as the axe's rhythm. She'd gather stones for the hearth, strap the twins to her back, while she planted little patches of onion and yarrow by the stream. In the evenings, they'd sit by the growing fire, smoke curling like a story waiting for a voice. It wasn't the life she'd imagined, back when she still believed in parlors and church bells and embroidered linens. But it was the one that fit her hands now, rough-edged and weather-worn, but real. The babies grew into toddlers, all elbows and laughter. One walked early, the other talked first. They answered to Navajo nicknames, and Amelia didn't correct them. Sometimes she still woke at night, heart racing, thinking she'd forgotten to feed them or left the fire too low, the old fear curling at the edges. But then she'd hear Toe breathing steady beside her, or the girls murmuring in their sleep, and the panic would pass like a gust through tall grass. Toe spoke more now, but never too much. He spoke when words meant something, when Amelia doubted herself, when she bent over in the garden with hands on her knees and whispered, "I don't know how to do this." He would say things like, "You're doing it." Simple, whole, unshakable. One night, the air turned suddenly warm. Summer in the hills arrived in a single breath, the kind that carries a storm in its mouth. Amelia stepped out into the dusk, the twins already tucked in their corner of the room, bellies full of sweetened root mash and stories about deer tracks. Toe stood at the edge of the field, staring west. She knew that look. Stillness wrapped in tension. The air held a strange charge, like the pause between a heartbeat and a wound. She moved beside him. "What is it?" He didn't speak right away. Then, quietly, "Someone's coming." The old fear stirred. Townsfolk? Ranchers? The men who'd scoffed at the sight of her walking beside a Navajo warrior with her chin high and her babies dark-eyed and curious? She said nothing. She just reached for the children, strapped them again to her chest and hip, and doused the fire to coals. She had learned. Stillness could be safety. But Toe didn't move to run. He stayed, bow in hand, not drawn. A rider appeared at twilight's edge, cloaked and slow-moving, leading a second horse. Amelia's throat clenched. But as the figure drew closer, she saw no rifle, no badge. Just a weather-beaten man and a weary expression. He carried a letter sealed in wax. "To Amelia Hastings," he said. Like tasting a name he wasn't sure he believed belonged here. She stepped forward, one child clinging to her sleeve. "I'm Amelia." He handed her the letter, nodded once to Toe, and turned back the way he came. Not a word more. She broke the seal with a breath held too long. Inside a folded deed. Land. Not the patch they lived on, but her original claim, left unmarked when her husband vanished. Some lawyer, it seemed, had taken interest in her survival. The town couldn't claim what she still lived to own. Toe watched her face shift as she read. "You could sell it," he said, watching her carefully. "I could," she replied. "But you won't." Amelia smiled then, small and true. "It's just dirt." They burned the letter that night. Let the flames eat every lie that had ever called her worthless. Let the wind carry the ash away. Later, as the girls dreamed of rivers and moccasins, Amelia lay beside Toe beneath a blanket stitched with mismatched threads. The fire crackled low beside them. "I was never meant for town," she whispered. "I bent myself into shapes for years trying to belong. And all along it was this dirt, this silence, this man beside me, that made me feel real." He looked at her then, long and deep. Belonging doesn't come from being seen by many. It comes from being known by one. Her throat tightened. "You see me." His hand found hers beneath the blanket. Not grasping, not claiming, just touching. "I always did." The wind outside shifted again, not sharp now, but warm, like breath against the back of the neck. Thunder rolled far off, promising rain that wouldn't bite. She rose before dawn the next morning, fed the children, packed a basket with berries and small loaves. Toe was already awake, sharpening a blade with the twins clambering at his feet. When the storm came, it broke fast, sheets of silver sweeping the hill, thunder echoing through the bones of the earth. The fire held. The roof did too. They stood in the doorway together, watching the storm run wild. Amelia leaned into him, soaked and grinning, the babies squealing with delight. Mud covered their toes. The world smelled like earth and lightning. It struck her then, not gently, but with the full force of a life reclaimed. She had not been rescued. She had risen. And the man beside her hadn't saved her. He had simply stayed, through storm and silence, judgment and fire. And when everything else had melted away, reputation, past, even her name spoken with disdain, what remained was this: hands calloused from building, eyes that did not flinch, a fire that had chosen her again and again, without asking for anything in return but truth. And in the quiet that followed the thunder, Amelia looked at the man she had once thought a stranger, and knew, without a word, that she had finally come home.